Welcome to the M1 Fitness Podcast. I'm your host, Marcus Sadu, and in this episode, I'm going to be chatting about whether the ketogenic diet is a sustainable long-term approach for fat loss. So first off, what is the ketogenic diet? The keto diet became popular in the 1920s, so this approach has been around for a while because it was originally used to treat epilepsy in children, and actually still to this day it is. It happened to reduce the incidence of seizures in a bunch of children, and so it gained a bunch of popularity as a treatment for that. Nowadays, it's gained traction more so as a weight loss diet, but that's not originally how it came into the limelight. Now, the ketogenic diet is essentially a very low-carb diet, typically landing in the range of something like 30 to 50 grams of total carbohydrates per day, depending on how active you are. Now, just to give you an idea of how much 30 grams of carbohydrates is, that would be about 2/3 of a cup of cooked rice or a large banana or a shitload of leafy green vegetables. Now, the difference in calories by reduced carbohydrates is made up by proteins and or fats. So you could call it a very low carb diet. You could also call it a moderate protein, higher fat diet. Same difference. Now, doing the ketogenic diet results in something called ketosis, which you may have heard of. Ketosis is sort of like a backup fuel system for the body. So the body's primary fuel or preferred fuel source is glucose, and the backup fuel source is ketones. So when we have adequate carbohydrates in the diet, the body runs off of primarily glucose. And when we don't have adequate amounts of carbohydrate in the diet, our backup fuel source kicks in, and it happens to be ketones. So when we're producing a bunch of ketones, this body state is called ketosis. Now, it's worth mentioning that ketosis is not a on or off sort of system, it's a scaling system. So even if you're following a diet that includes a bunch of carbohydrates, there will be times, for example, first thing in the morning after not eating for a larger period of time, that you will be producing some ketones. So it's not you're either producing them or you're not, it's a sliding scale. Now, why would we have a backup fuel source? It turns out humans don't want to die, and so there is a built-in contingency plan when it comes to starving. And ketones, as a backup fuel source, help us not to starve. Now, the absolute fastest way to get into ketosis or get your body to use this alternative fuel source is by fasting, meaning not eating anything at all. So you can take supplements like ketone esters or ketone salts to goose this process and make it, I'm not crazy about this word in this context, but quicker, getting into ketosis quicker. However, when it comes to getting into ketosis, quote unquote, naturally, the fastest way to do so is by not consuming any calories at all. And that makes sense, right? Because as I mentioned before, we've got this backup system in place that makes us more resistant to starvation. So it only makes sense that the fastest way to achieve that state is via not eating calories. Now, you can also get into ketosis by eating a ketogenic style diet. However, you will get there faster by not eating anything at all. How does the ketogenic diet work for fat loss? It works just like every single other diet out there. It's a calorie deficit. So you consume fewer calories than you burn and you lose fat, meaning even on a ketogenic diet, if you were to eat more calories than you were burning, you could still gain body fat using this dietary approach. So there's nothing special about ketosis or the keto diet itself for fat loss. It works just like every other diet out there on a physiological level. Having said that, from a behavioral and food choice standpoint, if you drastically reduce your food choices, it often makes it easier to lose fat in a sense. For example, if I say I'm no longer going to eat any carbohydrates, that reduces my food choices by a shitload. I mean, essentially, all fast food is off the table. Most all treat foods are a no-go. So basically, your options are proteins, fats, and a limited amount of vegetables. You're only going to want to eat so many chicken salads with olive oil, right? Obviously, there are more choices than that, but you get the idea. Now, as a little thought experiment, what if you decided to, instead of go on a ketogenic diet or a very low carb diet, you chose to do a very low fat diet? You'd need to eliminate essentially all fast food, most all treat foods, and you'd be limited to basically protein, starchy carbs like rice, potatoes, bread, and vegetables, but you couldn't use much of any sauces, butters, oils, etc. So what this shows is that when you cut out essentially an entire food group or limit it drastically, whether it be carbs or fats, you basically cut out all junk food, and also you limit your food options big time. Now, I point this out for a few reasons. One, carbs are not evil and neither is fat. It's consuming large quantities of both that get us into trouble. And two, eliminating an entire food group, whether it be carbs or fats, limits your food choices big time. And when you limit food choices, you inherently reduce calories in most cases because less options equates to fewer calories consumed in the real world for most folks. Think about going to a buffet. If you could only eat protein and fat, your choices are going to be really limited because you can't eat any foods containing carbs. If you could only eat protein and carbs, your choices again are going to be very limited because you can't eat any foods containing fat. But if you're eating proteins, carbs, and fats, you can eat any food you want at the buffet. Which of these three scenarios is going to result in the most calories consumed? Without a doubt, it's going to be the person eating proteins, carbs, and fats because they have way more choices. When you have limited choices, you naturally eat less because you just get tired of foods quicker. As a side note, if you were to purposefully eat a low protein, high carb, high fat diet, this is literally the fastest way to gain body fat. Protein is highly satiating, and so if you go out of your way to eat a low protein diet, just think about all the food options that are low in protein and high in carbs and fat. They're all the most calorie dense, low quality foods. Ice cream, donuts, cookies, cakes, muffins, etc. However, in the case of only eating protein and fats, or a ketogenic diet, there's only so much meat, vegetables, butter, oil, and sauces you're going to be able to stomach. And then in the case of eating protein and carbs, there's only so much meat, rice, and pasta you can eat without needing to add a sauce or some sort of fat for texture before you call it quits. So to wrap up this point, limiting food options is a really powerful tool for losing weight no matter what type of eating approach you choose to follow. Now, one highly motivating aspect for individuals doing the ketogenic diet right out of the gate is that folks often see large initial weight drops in, say, the first 7 to 10 days for two reasons. One, if they're in a calorie deficit, they'll lose some fat. And two, they're going to drop a fair bit of body water because when you eliminate carbs from the diet, you lose the body water that comes along with them. For every gram of carbohydrate that you eat, you store or hold about 3 grams of water with it. So for every gram of carbs you reduce in your diet, you're going to lose 3 grams of water. Now, folks following diets that contain carbs will lose fat also in the first 7 to 10 days in a calorie deficit, and they'll also drop some water because carb intake will likely come down, just not as much as in the ketogenic diet approach typically. But the kicker is, if you decide to include carbs back into your diet, whenever that may be, you're going to gain a proportionate amount of water weight back because it's not fat. It's just the water that carbohydrates pull into the body when they're consumed. These big initial weight drops often motivate people to keep going with the diet right out of the gate because they see this big drop on the scale and they think, hey, it's working. So this is something that keto has going for it for sure as far as folks following through with the protocol. Also, some folks really enjoy the food options on a keto diet and find it simple eating essentially just protein, vegetables, and fat. It's also just one less food group to prepare. So you don't need to prep things like potatoes, rice, oats, etc. So from a cooking standpoint, it can simplify things as well. Additionally to enjoying the food options, some people find the keto diet extremely satiating and they never really feel all that hungry. Now, No matter what diet you follow, hunger should only really be an issue when you get very lean. And if you're feeling hungry on a consistent basis and you still have quite a bit of fat to lose, your diet isn't structured properly. This is one of the primary reasons why I recommend eating single and minimal ingredient whole foods, whether you're doing a keto approach, low carb, high carb, whatever. Single and minimal ingredient whole foods are the way to go for long-term fat loss success because they're much more satiating and they're more nutrient dense. One distinction that I want to make around the keto diet is burning body fat versus using fat for fuel. So I'm not sure if a lot of the keto advocates either don't understand this concept fully or they use the play on words as a marketing tool. But I want to clear this up for you guys because it's a super important point. If you eat a diet higher in carbs and lower in fat, you're going to burn more carbs for fuel and less fat. If you eat a diet lower in carbs and higher in fat, like the keto diet, you're going to burn more fat for fuel and less carbs. Makes sense, right? Now, using fat for fuel is not the same as using body fat for fuel. You can use body fat for fuel in both scenarios as long as you're in a calorie deficit because by definition, you're burning more calories than you're taking in, and that's why your body dips into your body fat stores for energy. This is how you lose weight. But some of the hardcore keto advocates talk about burning fat for fuel, but don't distinguish between burning fat that you eat and body fat that's literally stored on your body. So this is a really important distinction because your body is really adaptive and it's going to use the fuel you give it, like I mentioned. So if you eat a higher carb diet, you're going to use more carbs for fuel. If you eat a higher fat diet, you're going to use more fat for fuel. But if you're not in a calorie deficit, you're not going to use any body fat for fuel in either of these scenarios. Again, it's sort of a play on words that some keto folks use that confuses the public because they hear use fat for fuel and think that it's body fat, which is understandable, not the dietary fat that they're eating because that's the dominant fuel source on a keto diet. The term use fat for fuel is the same as saying use carbs for fuel. Neither of these statements is addressing using body fat for fuel. So I really hope that makes sense because it's an important one. On the supplement front, there are all sorts of different products out there to use. And funny enough, the only supplement I might potentially recommend on a ketogenic diet is a salt supplement. Sodium demands in the body go up quite a bit on a ketogenic diet due to shifts in body water, carbohydrates, etc. So if you're having a hard time getting enough salt in your diet, I'd recommend supplementing with salt to make up the difference. Now, I haven't used this product personally and I have no affiliation with this company, but if I was to use a salt supplement, I would use Element personally. I'm a big fan of the owner of Element. He's also been on the pod chatting about salt. So if you want to learn more about salt intake specifically on the ketogenic diet or just in general for your health, I'd recommend listening to episode 80 with Rob Wolf titled Why You Need Salt in Your Diet. But if you're getting enough salt via just salting your food, you do not need to supplement. A supplement would just be a convenience and practicality thing because you need to eat quite a bit of salt on a keto diet, and lots of folks don't actually want the taste of that much salt on their food. So in that instance, they might use a salt supplement. Personally, I wouldn't invest my time or money into supplements like ketone esters or ketone salts because they're incredibly expensive and you can do just fine on a keto diet without them. There is some promising stuff around some of these ketone esters and salts in response to experiencing a TBI or a traumatic brain injury, but outside of very special and specific situations, I just don't see the need for them. Now, aside from the food and preference aspects of the keto diet, who might it be the right fit for? In general, what I've seen is that the keto diet tends to work better for folks who are less active in general or happen to implement less intense versions of exercise. So for example, folks who have desk jobs that don't do a lot of super vigorous workouts in their spare time. So if you lift a little bit of weights and walk for the vast majority of your movement practice, from a physical output standpoint, the keto diet might be the right fit for you. On the other hand, if you do CrossFit or you're cycling 100K a week or you lift weights really hard, for example, you're probably going to see a noticeable dip in performance if you decide to follow a keto diet due to the low carbohydrate availability. When it comes to performance, nothing beats carbohydrates, plain and simple. Now, I'm not talking about chugging Gatorade and downing those fucking garbage goo packs that some runners and cyclists use. I'm just talking about eating carb-containing whole foods like rice, oats, potatoes, yams, various sources of fruit, etc. Okay, so now we're at the most important part of the episode, and that's the concept of practicing how you play. So let's say your goal is fat loss and you're thinking about giving the ketogenic diet a go in order to reach your goal. If you plan on implementing carbs back into your diet at some point, the keto diet likely isn't the best fat loss approach for you, because if you lose the weight you'd like to lose via a keto approach, how are you going to implement carbs back in and maintain those losses after having lost the weight with a completely different diet structure? In my opinion, it's probably better to implement a version of a diet or structure that you see yourself following long term. So in other words, practicing how you play. From a sustainability standpoint, I can't tell you how many times I've heard folks say, I tried the keto diet and lost some weight and then put it back on because I started eating carbs again. Now, on the other hand, if you see yourself following a keto diet or a very low carb approach for years and years, then hey, you might want to give it a go. And I'll mention that I am not for the ketogenic diet or against it. I am all for the right tool for the right job. And I wanted to put this episode together because if you're going to try an approach like this, I want you to be informed prior to doing so. Now that we've laid out the info, if you're thinking, hey, this does sound like the right fit for me, how should you actually do it? There are better and worse versions of every single diet out there. And obviously, I'd rather someone implement a better version of the keto diet versus a worse one. So eating nothing but eggs, bacon, and butter is technically a ketogenic diet, but I would not recommend that. What I would recommend is eating single and minimal ingredient whole foods like meat, fish, eggs, maybe a bit of dairy if you tolerate it, plenty of leafy green vegetables. You might even be able to fit in a small amount of fruit like berries because they're very low in carbohydrates, and then a pretty good amount of fat via things like olive oil, avocados, nut seeds, coconut milk, etc. Now, if a client comes to me and says they'd like to implement the ketogenic diet, this is how I structure it because it's the most helpful way to do so. Now, you do have to be mindful with your carbohydrate load because foods like nuts, seeds, avocados, dairy, fruit, of course, vegetables, all have low amounts of carbohydrates in them, and they do add up. So that's just something to be aware of. Personally, I did the keto diet for a while, years ago, and I felt pretty decent. My performance was all right. However, I just prefer to eat starchy carbohydrates. I love rice, I love potatoes and yams and fresh fruit, and personally, I just rather reduce my fat intake to make room for more carbohydrates versus reduce my carbohydrate intake and eat a whole bunch of fat. That's just a personal preference thing for me. Also, I happen to do very well on a moderate to high protein, higher carb, lower fat diet. My performance is awesome. I feel great. I sleep really well. My blood sugar is nice and balanced, all of that good stuff. So for myself, I gave it a go and it wasn't the right fit, but everyone is different as far as their lifestyle goals, food preferences, etc. Now, as we start to wrap up here, I just want to say that there is nothing special about the ketogenic diet or any other diet for that matter out there. If the diet results in fat loss, it's because a calorie deficit is created in one way or another. So when you're choosing an approach that's right for you, you want to implement a diet structure that makes adherence or following the approach as seamless as possible. It's sort of like choosing a career. Not everyone has the same interests, and so as a result, we have all sorts of different jobs out there that people really enjoy. You want to take into account what the job is, so what you're actually doing and if you like it, what the schedule is, how your day-to-day looks, the financial compensation, the location, holiday structure, benefits, and the list goes on. For some folks, the right metaphorical job may be the ketogenic diet. For others, it could just be a lower carb approach. Some of my clients follow higher carb diets. You've just got to figure out what the best fit is for you. I hope you guys found this episode useful, and if you're interested in personalized one-on-one nutritional coaching and or workout design with me, you can head over to n1fitness.com/coaching or just click the link in the show notes below. Also follow me up on Instagram at n1fitness and friend me on Facebook at Marcus Sadu. Thanks so much for listening, guys, and I will catch you on the next episode. See ya!